On the 1st of October, 331 BC, Alexander the Great, king of Macedon, and his army clashed with the forces of the Persian Empire at the Battle of Gaugamela in what is now northern Iraq. Ancient Greek sources are notoriously unreliable when it comes to establishing the size of armies and often exaggerated the size of non-Greek armies to make the Greeks or Macedonians appear more prodigious. In this case, though, it is clear that Alexander's army was much smaller in size than that of the Persian king Darius. Modern estimates place his army around 50,000 men, while the Persians had maybe close to twice that amount. However, by the end of the Battle of Gaugamela, the Persians had been defeated, and Alexander continued onwards to absolutely obliterate the rest of the Persian Empire. By the end of 330 BC, he had effectively conquered Persia, defeating the world's foremost imperial power after a 4-year-long campaign. How did he manage to do this? Alexander's army deployed hoplite infantry soldiers in a phalanx battle formation in a way that rendered Persia's infantry and cavalry units ineffective. Through disciplined military tactics and the phalanx, a numerically inferior army destroyed the largest empire the world had seen up until that time. Alexander would soon build a new empire that stretched from Greece to the outskirts of India, eclipsing the Persian one that it had conquered. So why were his tactics, specifically the phalanx, so effective? The phalanx wasn't unique to 4th century BC. Images from stone slabs and friezes indicate that phalanx-type formations were being used in the ancient Middle East as early as the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. In essence, a phalanx is just an arrangement whereby soldiers line up in a square or rectangular formation, and then use large shields to form a wall or defensive perimeter. We see something similar in funerary art and wall paintings from ancient Egypt, during the era of the New Kingdom between around 1550 BC and 1100 BC, during which ancient Egypt reached the peak of its power. The army of the pharaohs was centered on compact infantry units of men fighting with melee weapons, like swords, spears, and shields. These suggest blocks of about 40 men, moving 4 across and 10 deep, with the men on the outer lines using their shields to form a wall that protected the perimeter of the entire unit. In Egypt and other similar Bronze Age cultures, like the Hittites, these infantry phalanxes were supplemented by large numbers of chariots that moved around at high speed on the battlefield to plug holes, while the infantry moved steadily forward at a slower pace. The Battle of Kadesh, fought between Pharaoh Ramses II of Egypt and the Hittite Empire, is famous for the fact that thousands of chariots were on the battlefield. But the core of both armies would still have been tens of thousands of infantry, organized into phalanx-style divisions. The phalanx is most commonly associated with ancient Greece, where well-trained infantry armed with shields and spears, or swords, were arranged into phalanx divisions. These were specific types of arrangements whereby groups of 32 men, for instance, might line up in 4 lines of 8 men into a rectangular shape. There was no strict rule for how many men might form a phalanx, but the core idea was that they acted as a cohesive unit, where men to either side protected each other, and the unit moved forwards, backwards, or sideways as one. A large phalanx could consist of hundreds of men operating together, as was the case by the time of Alexander's campaigns against the Persians. By then, a common phalanx arrangement was 8 men wide and 16 deep, meaning it consisted of 128 soldiers. Some, though, were double this size, maybe 256 soldiers, for example. Each phalanx had a kind of unit commander who dictated their movements. These carried different names depending on the kingdom or city-state involved. Something akin to phalanx formations were being used in Greece as far back as the Bronze Age during the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. Frescoes and other art from Mycenaean cities and settlement sites indicate that groups of infantry moved as one and used shield walls to protect their flanks, front, and rear. The shield was particularly important during this early period, as many of the rank-and-file soldiers couldn't afford expensive body armor, so their shields were their greatest defense. The phalanx would later be readopted as the Iron Age developed, and Greek culture began to spread around the Mediterranean through hundreds of Greek military and commercial colonies. But the phalanx is most keenly associated with classical Greece, roughly between 600 BC and 300 BC. During this period, Greek city-states had citizen soldiers, known as hoplites, who fought in phalanx formations on the battlefield. Their typical weaponry consisted of breastplate armor, leg guards, and a helmet, with a large hoplon shield, from which their name is derived, and a lengthy spear as their primary weapon. The hoplite phalanx became the most effective fighting unit in the ancient world. These were disciplined soldiers, well-ordered and strategically deployed. When one man was wounded, he could melt back into the wider unit and be replaced by a fresher fighter from the center of the phalanx. This also applied in longer skirmishes to those who just became tired, meaning that the hoplites of the phalanx could fight better for longer. The relatively compact and rectangular shape of the phalanx also meant that the men on the sides or the rear could turn to fend off attacks from all directions. The effectiveness of the phalanx was demonstrated during the two Persian invasions of Greece in the 490s and 480s BC, during which numerically superior Persian hordes were repulsed by the Greeks. This reached its peak during Alexander's wars. Macedon, Alexander's home, was not a fully Greek state. The Greeks of cities like Athens and Thebes considered the Macedonians to be uncouth barbarians to the north, but there were cultural similarities, one of which being the Greek fighting methods. So, in the reign of King Philip II, Alexander's father, the Macedonians had moved away from their traditional reliance on cavalry to adopt the hoplite and phalanx. If you know anything about Alexander the Great, or watched anything about him or read anything about him, you've probably heard over and over that one of the biggest reasons he was so successful is because of better technology. And in this case, better technology just means a really, really long spear. Philip had devised this new weapon and it was widely employed. This was the Sarissa, a huge spear that was up to 7 meters long. It was a long spear pole with a large metal spike at the end. The utility of this weapon was that it rendered cavalry ineffective. A hoplite at the front of the phalanx, also sometimes known as a phalangite, could kneel down and prop his sarissa upwards in such a way that it extended out meters in front of him. And often the men of the second or even third line back in the phalanx could extend their sarissa all the way out to the front. This created a spear wall that could break up any cavalry charge. And because the Persians relied to such a great extent on cavalry divisions, the sarissa phalanx combo was devastating for them. This, in large part, is how Alexander was able to conquer Persia so quickly, despite the Persians having much larger armies. Alexander also expanded the size of the average phalanx unit. The front line of hoplites, or phalangites, would have to move backwards after a charge by the enemy, so they'd be replaced by the next in line, as the sarissa was often a single-use weapon that became embedded in enemy cavalrymen or horses. Afterwards, they had short swords as secondary weapons that they would use once the initial stages of battle gave way to close-quarters melee fighting. Eventually, after the early death of Alexander at the age of 32 for allegedly partying too hard or some other cool-sounding cause of death, the empire he had built so quickly would fall apart just about as fast. The territory would be split up amongst his generals, since he had no clear heir or successor. But the phalanx survived. The Macedonians and Greeks had unwittingly birthed the military innovations that would eventually lead to their own undoing. The Greeks had spread far and wide around the Mediterranean and Black Sea between the 9th and 6th centuries BC, establishing colonies as far as what is modern-day France and Crimea. In Sicily and southern Italy, there was a dense concentration of Greek colonies, to the extent that the region became known as Magna Graecia, Great Greece. Wherever these colonies were developed, the use of hoplite citizen soldiers in a phalanx formation followed. And because this way of fighting was so effective, the native groups in the vicinity of Greek colonies soon began adopting their own versions. One region where the use of hoplites and phalanxes spread to was central Italy, where the native Italian or Latin groups, like the Etruscans and Romans, began using their own variants. And can you guess which group of people adapted these tactics the best? Although it would evolve over time, initially the Romans used a hoplite-type citizen army arrayed in phalanxes during the earliest days of the Republic. Gradually, this evolved and they began using their own distinct forms of these tactics. For instance, while the armor of the Roman legionaries, even centuries later, was still highly indebted to the hoplite armor of the Greeks, the Romans began to prefer the use of a short sword, or gladius, instead of a spear as their primary weapon. The square or rectangular-shaped phalanx also morphed into what is now known as the maniple. This was a unit of around 120 men, formed into 3 long lines of 40. Military historians believe that the format was adopted to adapt to the hilly terrain of central Italy. Over time, the Roman legionaries began to develop the most effective fighting force in the Mediterranean and had conquered Italy by the 4th century BC, followed by the Western Mediterranean in the 3rd century and the Eastern Mediterranean between 200 BC and 30 BC. As they did so, they defeated the Hellenistic or Greek kingdoms of the East that had emerged out of Alexander's empire. During this process, the Greek hoplites and phalanxes were superseded by the Roman legionary and the maniple. The Roman Empire would of course go on to conquer much of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. As it did, it absorbed many of the elements of warfare practiced by groups like the Celts and the Germanic tribes to the north, and the Parthians in the Middle East. At the same time, bunched infantry and kind of Greek phalanx style remained central to Roman legions for centuries. These methods were tweaked in some cases. The shield wall and sword stayed central to how legionaries fought, as did the kind of rigid training that Greeks had pioneered and Romans adopted. But the Roman legions adopted a more flexible formation over time known to military historians today as the triple line. This meant that the maniple was organized into 3 lines, with one line moving backwards in the formation and being replaced by the one behind them. Eventually, though, the Roman legions began to become more cavalry-based towards the end of the empire, to defend against the ever-growing number of attacks on the borders by Germanic invaders. As this happened, there was a move away from the bunched infantry of the phalanx kind. Cataphracts, a kind of heavy cavalry, became the new focus of the Roman military. It would be several centuries later, during the medieval era, that the phalanx-style method of fighting became central once again in Europe and the Mediterranean. The Dark Ages, or Middle Ages, whatever you want to call them, followed the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in Western Europe. This was a period in which the political systems that had existed in places like France, Britain, and the Iberian Peninsula for centuries collapsed. Trade routes vanished, and people left the cities and towns that had characterized Roman life to go fend for themselves growing crops and raising livestock in the countryside. This might seem unrelated to the phalanx, but it was actually very interconnected. As societal wealth deteriorated, armies could no longer rely on expensive cavalry divisions or elaborate iron armor. The battlefields of Europe once again became dominated by bands of infantry, who often had to rely on relatively basic methods of fighting. And pretty soon, the shield wall that had characterized the early phalanx divisions of Greece reappeared in a new form. This was the case with the Vikings or Norse raiders who came out of Scandinavia to conquer large parts of Europe between the late 8th and 10th centuries. The Vikings often fought in compact groups using large shields, swords, helmets, and minimal body armor, not entirely different from the Greek hoplite methods. This continued through the age of the Norman conquest in the 11th and 12th centuries. The Normans were themselves descendants of the Northmen, Vikings, who had conquered northern France at the end of the 9th century. If we look at something like the Bayeux Tapestry, we see tightly compacted groups of Norman infantry with their shields overlapping. They may not have been quite as well drilled as Greek hoplites or Roman legionaries. For instance, there is little available evidence to suggest that Normans fought in rows that changed shape as one line of fighters became tired and so forth, but the basic principles were there. Infantry using large shields that formed a wall to protect the wider division. The Normans were some of the greatest fighters of their day in Europe and managed to expand Western Christendom by leading crusades to the Holy Land and conquering Sicily from the Arab Moors who controlled the island. They were superseded in the late medieval period by a new species of phalanx-type infantry, Swiss Pike and Landsknecht. I literally never know how to say this.
Landsknecht.
Swiss Pike were soldiers who fought for the Swiss city-states and who became mercenaries that were highly sought after by Europe's monarchs. The
Landsknecht
were German divisions who fought as mercenaries. These were infantry and typically fought with pikes in rows of soldiers, not at all dissimilar to Greek hoplites. The difference here was that the shield was replaced in favor of heavy body armor. After centuries of using chainmail, the new type of armor consisted of plates of iron assembled in such a way as to protect large parts of the body. Basically, instead of holding a shield, now you're wearing one. This freed the pikemen up to wield a heavy pike with both hands. Pikes were something like 3 meters long or could have been up to 5 or 6 meters. What made the pike so effective was that they could strike their enemy in an infantry engagement before the enemy could even get into striking range. Europe soon followed suit, and by the end of the late medieval period, armies all over Europe were switching from using swords to pikes. It wouldn't be long before the Swiss pikes soon lost their efficacy, and at the same time, the use of phalanx-style infantry started to decline. The reason for this is pretty obvious. In the early 14th century, the first firearms were made in Europe. It took about 2 centuries for these methods to be refined, but by the 16th century, soldiers across Europe were being armed with muskets and other firearms. What soldiers needed now was something that could protect all of their body and protect from a distance. This process had already somewhat been underway in the late medieval era to protect against arrows from the deadly English longbow. Once this was all set in motion and the years were rolling by, the idea of a phalanx-style tactic was pretty quickly abandoned. Guns would obviously go on to become even more effective, and armor was done away with altogether. Once the machine gun came around in the middle of the 19th century, you just start looking for cover. Infamously, trench warfare became increasingly brutal during World War I. This was also a time period where people started realizing any semblance of the old ways of warfare were completely gone at this point. New tactics and technology needed to be adopted. It was a long way from the humble Phalanx, but the idea was the same: to protect oneself however possible in battle.